November 28th, 1867. Thanksgiving Day in the American South. The scent of roasted turkey should have filled the air at Riverside Manor, but instead, something darker simmered in the kitchen. Colonel Benjamin Hayes and his 3 sons gathered around the mahogany dining table, laughing over whiskey, completely unaware that their cook had other plans for the feast. Martha Williams stood at the massive cast-iron stove, stirring a cauldron of boiling lard, her weathered hands steady as stone. But her eyes burned with 20 years of buried rage. By sunset, the colonel and his boys would be dead, scalded alive in the very oil meant to crisp their golden bird. And it all began with a promise broken, a daughter stolen, and a mother's love turned to liquid fire. Before we dive deeper into this chilling tale of vengeance, served hot, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because stories like Martha's deserve to be remembered. The kitchen at Riverside Manor had witnessed decades of cruelty disguised as hospitality. Steam rose from copper pots like ghosts seeking escape. The floorboards, worn smooth by countless servants' feet, creaked under the weight of secrets. Martha Williams had spent half her life in this suffocating space, feeding the very men who treated her like livestock with a voice. Her hands bore the scars of countless burns from their impatience, their demands, their casual violence wrapped in Southern charm. But tonight, those same scarred hands would serve justice in portions too large to swallow. The war had ended 2 years earlier. Papers called it reconstruction, but nothing had been rebuilt at Riverside Manor except new ways to cage the same birds. Colonel Hayes still ruled his 1,000 acres with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. He paid his workers now, sure, pennies on the dollar for dawn to dusk labor. He called them employees instead of property, but the whips still sang their bloody songs when quotas weren't met. And Martha remained exactly where she'd always been, stirring pots and swallowing screams. The colonel's sons had returned for the holiday. 3 grown men shaped by their father's poison, each carrying their own brand of cruelty. William, the eldest at 32, had inherited his father's taste for control and his grandfather's collection of shackles, though he called them restraints for difficult workers. Charles, the middle son, possessed a silver tongue that could convince a drowning man to buy water, and he used that gift to justify every horror committed on the plantation. And then there was young Thomas, barely 25, whose laughter could freeze blood in August heat. Martha knew them all too well. She'd watched them grow from spoiled boys into monsters, fed them breakfast after they'd spent nights terrorizing the quarters, served them dinner while they planned which families to separate come spring. She'd been their cook, their invisible servant, their silent witness for 20 years. But silence, Martha had learned, could be its own kind of weapon. The story truly began 5 years earlier, on another Thanksgiving that should have been filled with gratitude, but instead overflowed with grief. Martha's daughter, Rebecca, had been the light of her world. 17 years old, beautiful as morning dew, with dreams bigger than the cotton fields that surrounded them. Rebecca could read, a skill Martha had taught her in secret, scratching letters in dirt behind the smokehouse. The girl had plans to run north, to find freedom in cities where black women could walk with their heads held high. Colonel Hayes had other plans. Rebecca disappeared on a Tuesday morning in October. No goodbye, no explanation, just an empty bed and a mother's heart torn clean in half. When Martha finally worked up the courage to ask, the colonel explained with the casual tone one might use to discuss the weather that Rebecca had been sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. A business arrangement, he called it. The girl would learn discipline, he said, and Martha should be grateful her daughter was getting such a fine education. Martha didn't speak for 3 days. When her voice returned, it came back changed, harder, like steel tempered in flame. She asked only one question: would she ever see Rebecca again? The colonel's answer was a laugh that echoed through the manor like a death rattle. "Of course not," he said. "The girl belonged to someone else now. Best to forget she ever existed." But Martha didn't forget. She couldn't. Every meal she prepared, every dish she served, every smile she forced when the Hayes family gathered around their table, it all became fuel for a fire that burned deeper than bone. She began to pay attention to things she'd never noticed before. How the colonel took his coffee, black as his heart with 3 spoonfuls of sugar. How William preferred his meat rare, bloody as his conscience. How Charles liked his vegetables soft as his spine when confronted with real opposition. How Thomas devoured sweets like a child, sweet as the lies he told himself about being a good man. Martha studied them the way a hunter studies prey. She learned their habits, their weaknesses, their routines. She discovered that Thomas suffered from a weak stomach that rebelled against rich foods. She noticed how Charles broke into hives when he ate certain shellfish. She observed how William's hands shook after too much whiskey, how he became clumsy, vulnerable. And the colonel had a heart that skipped beats when he got excited, when his blood ran hot with anger or lust or the simple pleasure of causing pain. Knowledge became Martha's currency, and she spent 5 years collecting it like a miser hoards gold. She learned which herbs could cause a man's throat to close, which roots could make his stomach feel like it was digesting itself, which berries could stop a heart mid-beat. Her mother had been a root woman back in Georgia, before the traders came, and some memories run deeper than chains. Martha remembered the old songs, the old ways, the old wisdom that white men dismissed as superstition. The kitchen became her laboratory. Behind the flour barrels and beneath the cutting boards, she stored her arsenal. Foxglove for the heart, oleander for the stomach, castor beans for the blood. She tested them carefully, a pinch here, a drop there, on rats first, then on the colonel's hunting dogs when they grew too aggressive. She learned the dosages, the timing, the perfect balance between medicine and murder, but poison felt too gentle for the Hayes family. Too quick. Too merciful. Martha wanted them to suffer as she had suffered, to feel the heat of helplessness, the burning sensation of watching everything you loved disappear. She wanted them to understand what it felt like to be consumed from the inside out. That's when she remembered the lard. Every Thanksgiving, Martha prepared the turkey in the same massive cauldron that had served the Hayes family for generations. The oil would heat to a rolling boil, hot enough to crisp skin in seconds, hot enough to cook meat to the bone, hot enough to kill a man if he happened to fall in, or if someone happened to push him. The plan formed slowly, like a storm gathering strength over deep water. She would prepare the feast as always, but this time the main course wouldn't be turkey. She would serve the Hayes men what they had served her family for decades, pain so pure it burned away everything else. She would cook them in the same oil that had fried 1,000 meals, using the same fire that had warmed their bellies while her heart stayed frozen. Martha spent months preparing, not just the method but the moment. She studied the layout of the kitchen, memorizing every pot, every pan, every possible weapon. She loosened the floorboards near the stove, creating hidden compartments for her tools. She practiced her movements until they became muscle memory, until she could navigate the kitchen blindfolded. She prepared escape routes and alibis, though deep down she knew she wouldn't need them. This wasn't about surviving. This was about settling accounts. As Thanksgiving approached, Martha's resolve hardened like winter ground. She thought about Rebecca every morning when she lit the fires, every evening when she cleaned the pots. Her daughter would be 22 now, if she was still alive. Old enough to have children of her own. Children who would grow up free if Martha succeeded. Children who would never know the Hayes name or feel their cruelty. The night before Thanksgiving, Martha stood in the kitchen alone, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the weapons of her revenge. Tomorrow, she would cook her final meal for the Hayes family. Tomorrow, she would serve them justice in portions they couldn't refuse. Tomorrow, She would show them what it meant to be consumed. She whispered a prayer to her mother, to her daughter, to all the souls who had suffered and died on Riverside Manor. She asked for strength, for steady hands, for the courage to see it through. And in the darkness of that kitchen, with only the dying embers for light, Martha Williams smiled for the first time in 5 years. The feast was about to begin. Thanksgiving morning arrived wrapped in fog that clung to the manor like guilt refusing to lift. The sun struggled through grey clouds, casting everything in the pale light of Judgment Day. Martha rose before dawn, as she had every morning for 20 years, but today her movements carried a different weight. Each step across the creaking floorboards sounded like drum beats, marking time until reckoning. The kitchen stood ready. Every pot gleamed, every knife lay sharpened, every surface scrubbed clean as an altar prepared for sacrifice. The massive cast iron cauldron sat waiting on the stove, empty but expectant, like a mouth preparing to swallow lies whole. Martha filled it slowly with lard, watching the white chunks dissolve into golden liquid as the fire beneath began its hungry work. From the main house, she could hear the haze men stirring, boots on hardwood, voices raised in laughter, the clink of bottles being opened before breakfast had even been served. They were celebrating already, toasting their good fortune, their power, their unshakable belief that the world existed to serve their appetites. Colonel Hayes held court in the parlour, regaling his sons with stories of the old days when discipline meant something, when people knew their place and stayed in it. Martha listened to every word as she prepared the vegetables, her knife moving with mechanical precision. She carved turnips like she was carving hearts, peeled potatoes like she was stripping away skin, chopped onions until tears ran down her cheeks, though not from the fumes. Each cut was deliberate, each slice a small act of preparation for what was to come. The lard had begun to bubble now, sending tendrils of steam toward the ceiling like prayers ascending to heaven, or perhaps like souls departing earth. The temperature was rising, degree by deadly degree, transforming simple cooking fat into something far more dangerous. Martha tested it with a wooden spoon, watching the wood sizzle and char at the edges. Almost ready, William entered the kitchen first, drawn by the rich aroma of holiday cooking. He stood in the doorway, surveying Martha's work with the casual assessment of a man inspecting property. His shirt was already stained with whiskey, though the morning was barely half spent. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly from the previous night's indulgences. "Smells good in here, Martha," he drawled, his voice thick with false familiarity. "Hope you're making extra. We've got appetites today." He moved closer to the stove, peering into pots with the presumptuous curiosity of someone who had never been denied anything. "What's all this bubbling about? Making something special for us?" Martha kept her eyes down, her voice steady as stone. "Just the turkey, Master William. Got to get the oil hot enough to cook it proper." She stirred the lard with long, measured strokes, creating whirlpools that caught the light like liquid amber. "Your daddy always did like his bird crispy." William laughed, a sound like glass breaking in the distance. "Daddy likes a lot of things crispy. Don't you, Martha? Remember that field hand who got too familiar with the housemaids? Daddy made him crispy as bacon." His laugh grew louder, crueler. "Course you remember. You had to scrub the blood off the whipping post afterward." The wooden spoon in Martha's hand trembled once, just once, then resumed its steady stirring. Her voice remained level, empty of everything except 20 years of practiced submission. "Yes, sir, I remember." "Good," William said, reaching over to dip his finger into a bowl of gravy. "Good to know some folks still remember their lessons." He sucked the gravy from his finger with exaggerated pleasure, then wiped his hand on Martha's apron without asking. "Make sure there's plenty of everything. Thomas brought his appetite from Charleston, and Charles has been bragging about your cooking for weeks. As if summoned by his name, Charles appeared in the doorway, resplendent in a burgundy waistcoat that strained across his growing belly. His face was flushed with morning whiskey and the anticipation of gluttony. Behind him lurked Thomas, younger but no less corrupted, his eyes already scanning the kitchen for something to mock or destroy. "Brother William!" Charles boomed, spreading his arms wide like a preacher welcoming sinners. "Look at our Martha, working her magic once again. 20 years of faithful service, and still turning out feasts fit for kings." He moved toward the stove with the swagger of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. "What delicacies await us today, Martha? What treasures have you conjured from your cauldron?" The cauldron. The word hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications Charles was too drunk and too arrogant to understand. Martha glanced up at him, her eyes meeting his for just a moment, long enough for him to see something that made him pause. But the moment passed, dismissed by his whiskey-addled brain as imagination. "Turkey, Master Charles," Martha replied, her voice carrying an odd note that might have been anticipation. "Fresh turkey, cooked the way your family likes it, hot and fast and thorough, and—" Thomas snickered from his position near the door, his boyish face twisted with the kind of cruelty that comes naturally to those born without conscience. "Hot and fast, just like that pretty daughter of yours used to be, eh, Martha? Before we sent her south to learn some manners." The kitchen went silent, except for the bubbling of the lard. Martha's hand tightened on the spoon, her knuckles going white as bone. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the fire crackling beneath the cauldron, hungry flames licking at iron like tongues tasting metal. William and Charles exchanged glances, recognizing the danger in their youngest brother's words, but too amused to intervene. They had always enjoyed watching Thomas push boundaries, seeing how far he could go before breaking something irreparably. It was a game they had played since childhood, using other people's pain as entertainment. "Now, Thomas," Charles said with mock concern, though his eyes glittered with malicious delight. "That's not polite conversation for the kitchen. Martha's trying to cook our dinner." "I'm just making conversation," Thomas protested, his grin widening. "Asking about family. Isn't that what Thanksgiving's about? Being grateful for family?" He stepped closer to Martha, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, close enough to see the cruel pleasure dancing in his pale eyes. "You are grateful, aren't you, Martha? Grateful for all we've done for you? All the opportunities we've provided?" Martha lifted her head slowly, looking directly at Thomas for the first time in years. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every sleepless night, every tear shed in darkness, every prayer whispered for a daughter who would never come home. "Oh yes, Master Thomas," she said softly, her words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "I'm grateful for everything you've taught me, every single lesson." Something in her tone made William shift uncomfortably. Charles frowned, his whiskey-fogged brain trying to process the subtle change in the kitchen's atmosphere. But Thomas, drunk on his own power and too young to recognize genuine danger, pressed forward. "Good," he said, reaching out to pat Martha's cheek with condescending familiarity. "Because today's about celebrating what we have, what we've built together, this beautiful home, this profitable land, this perfect family tradition." His hand was inches from her face when Martha moved. Not violently, not obviously, just a subtle shift that brought her closer to the stove, closer to the bubbling cauldron, closer to 20 years of patient preparation finally reaching its boiling point. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her eyes never leaving his. "It surely is time to celebrate what we've built. Time to serve up exactly what's been cooking all these years." The lard had reached perfect temperature now, rolling and churning like a golden sea of judgment. Steam rose in thick columns, carrying with it the scent of approaching justice. And Martha Williams, cook and servant and mother and executioner, smiled the smile of someone who had finally found the perfect recipe for revenge. The feast was about to begin, and everyone would get exactly what they deserved. The temperature in the kitchen had shifted, not from the fire alone, but from something deeper, something that had been simmering for decades. Martha felt it in her bones, the way animals sense storms before the first cloud appears. The Hayes brothers stood around her like vultures circling carrion, but they didn't understand what was already dead in that room. Their arrogance, their certainty, their belief that tomorrow would look exactly like yesterday. Colonel Benjamin Hayes chose that moment to make his entrance. 73 years old, still straight-backed and proud, wearing his Confederate grey waistcoat like armour against a world that had dared to change without his permission. His boots clicked against the kitchen stones with military precision, each step announcing his authority to walls that had heard the same sound for 40 years. "Boys," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command. "Stop pestering Martha and let her work. We've got guests arriving soon, and I won't have them think we've gone soft just because the world's turned upside down." He surveyed the kitchen with the practiced eye of a general inspecting fortifications. "Though I must say, it smells like heaven in here. Martha, you've outdone yourself again." Martha curtsied slightly, the movement so practiced it seemed carved from muscle memory. "Thank you, Colonel. Just trying to make sure everything's perfect for your Thanksgiving table." She gestured toward the bubbling cauldron with her wooden spoon. "The oil's almost ready for the turkey. Won't be but another few minutes now." The Colonel nodded approvingly, then turned to address his sons with the tone he'd once used to rally troops before battle. "Gentlemen, today we celebrate not just our blessings, but our survival. 2 years ago, carpetbaggers and their sympathizers told us our way of life was over, said we'd have to bow and scrape to every field hand with delusions of equality." His voice rose, filling the kitchen with the passion of old grievances. "But look around you. Riverside Manor still stands. Our land still produces. Our workers still know their place, even if we have to call them by different names now." William raised an imaginary glass in salute. "To the old ways, Daddy. May they never truly die." "To family tradition," Charles added, his words slurring slightly around the edges. "To getting what you deserve," Thomas chimed in, grinning at his own cleverness. Martha stirred the lard with steady strokes, each circle bringing the oil closer to perfect killing heat. "To getting what you deserve," she repeated softly, so softly that only the fire seemed to hear her. "That's surely worth celebrating." The Colonel's chest swelled with pride as he watched his sons, seeing in them the continuation of everything he'd built, everything he'd fought to preserve. He moved closer to the stove, drawn by the warmth and the rich aroma of holiday preparation. "Martha, I want you to know how much we appreciate your loyalty. 20 years you've been with this family, through war and reconstruction, through all the changes that tried to tear apart everything decent folks built. But you stayed. You remained faithful." "Yes, sir," Martha replied, testing the oil's temperature with a wooden spoon that hissed and bubbled on contact. "I surely did stay. Couldn't imagine being anywhere else." She looked up at him with eyes that held depths he'd never bothered to explore. "This kitchen, this family, it's been my whole world. Everything I ever loved, everything I ever lost, happened right here in this house." Something flickered across the Colonel's weathered features, a momentary recognition that perhaps there were currents in this conversation he hadn't mapped. But the moment passed, overwhelmed by his fundamental inability to see Martha as anything more than a fixture, a useful tool that happened to breathe. "Well," he said, clapping his hands together with finality, "enough sentiment. Let's get this bird in the oil and start this feast properly. Thomas, go fetch the turkey from the cold room. William, make sure the dining room's set proper. Charles, stop drinking my good whiskey and help your brothers. We've got a reputation to maintain." The sons scattered to their tasks with the casual efficiency of men who'd never questioned their right to command. But as they moved through the kitchen, each brushing past Martha with the careless familiarity of lifetime privilege, none of them noticed how her grip tightened on the wooden spoon, or how her eyes followed their movements with the focused intensity of a predator calculating distance and timing. Thomas returned first, struggling with a massive turkey that must have weighed 30 pounds. He dropped it onto the preparation table with unnecessary force, sending a spray of blood across the wooden surface. "There's your bird, Martha. Hope your oil's hot enough because I'm hungry enough to eat it raw." Martha approached the table with measured steps, running her hands over the turkey's pale skin with something approaching reverence. "Oh, it's a beautiful bird, Master Thomas. Fat and tender, just perfect for what I have in mind." She lifted it easily despite its weight, cradling it against her chest like a sleeping child. "The oil's ready. Been waiting for this moment all morning." She carried the turkey toward the bubbling cauldron, the haze men following behind like a funeral procession. The lard had reached that perfect state of liquid fury, rolling and churning with barely contained violence. Steam rose in thick columns, distorting the air above the pot until everything beyond seemed dreamlike, unreal. "Careful now," the colonel warned, moving closer to watch the process. "That oil's hot enough to take your skin clean off." "Yes, sir," Martha agreed, positioning herself between the stove and the watching men. "Hot enough to cook anything through to the bone." She held the turkey suspended above the cauldron, letting drops of moisture fall into the oil where they exploded into tiny geysers of scalding fat. Some things need that kind of heat to be done proper. Some things been waiting so long to cook. They need fire that burns all the way down to the soul. The kitchen had grown quiet except for the violent bubbling of the lard and the crackling of the fire beneath. Even the haze men seemed to sense that something was shifting, that the familiar rhythm of their Thanksgiving preparation had somehow slipped off its expected track. Martha stood perfectly still for a heartbeat, the turkey held high, her weathered face lit by fire from below and steam from above. When she spoke again, her voice carried a strange music, like wind through broken glass or water over stones worn smooth by centuries of patient grinding. "You know, Colonel, in all these years of cooking for your family, I learned something important about heat, about how long it takes to cook different kinds of meat, about how some flesh needs gentle warming, and some needs fire so hot it changes everything it touches." She lowered the turkey slightly, letting it hover just inches above the roiling oil. "I learned that the tenderest meat comes from things that suffered the most while they lived. All that pain and fear, it breaks down the fibers, makes everything soft and sweet." Thomas shifted nervously, his drunken bravado faltering in the face of Martha's unexpected eloquence. "Martha, what are you talking about? Just put the damn bird in the oil." But Martha continued as if he hadn't spoken, her voice growing stronger, more musical, carrying undertones that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. "I also learned that some hungers can't be satisfied with regular food. Some appetites need something special, something that's been marinating in its own juices for years and years, something that knows exactly what it's feeding." Colonel Hayes frowned, his military instincts finally registering that something was wrong in his kitchen. "Martha, that's enough philosophy. Cook the turkey." Martha smiled then, an expression so radiant it transformed her entire face. For a moment, she looked like the young woman who'd first come to work at Riverside Manor, full of hope and dreams and belief that tomorrow might be better than today. But there was something else in that smile now, something that had been forged in the fires of 2 decades of silent suffering. "Oh, I'm going to cook something, Colonel. I'm going to cook exactly what this family's been hungry for all these years." She lifted the turkey higher, her arms steady despite its weight. "I'm going to feed you what you've been craving without even knowing it." The lard had reached a fever pitch now, bubbling and churning like a golden sea in storm. The heat rising from it was so intense that sweat beaded on the faces of everyone in the kitchen, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with barely contained energy. And Martha Williams, cook and servant and mother and instrument of justice, prepared to serve the Hayes family their final meal. The moment stretched like hot metal being hammered into shape. The turkey hung suspended above the cauldron, Martha's arms trembling not from the weight, but from 20 years of restraint finally reaching its breaking point. The Hayes men watched with growing unease as something fundamental shifted in the kitchen's atmosphere, as if the very air had decided to hold its breath. Then Martha's grip loosened, but instead of the turkey dropping into the oil, her hands moved with sudden, shocking speed. The bird swung sideways, its massive weight becoming a weapon as she brought it crashing into Thomas's face with a wet, sickening thud. The youngest Hayes' son staggered backward, blood streaming from his broken nose, his hands clawing at his eyes as he tried to clear his vision. "What the hell?" William started, but Martha was already moving. She dropped the turkey and spun toward the cauldron, her hands closing around the iron handles that she'd wrapped with thick cloth hours earlier. The massive pot, filled with 30 pounds of boiling lard, lifted from the stove with surprising ease. Years of kitchen work had made Martha stronger than any of them realized, and rage had given her strength that went beyond muscle and bone. "Martha, no!" Colonel Hayes shouted, finally understanding what was about to happen. But understanding came too late, far too late. The first splash of oil caught Thomas as he stumbled backward, still clutching his ruined face. The lard hit him across the chest and shoulders, and his screams shattered the air like breaking crystal. His shirt dissolved instantly, and the flesh beneath began to cook with a sound like bacon hitting a hot pan. He dropped to his knees, writhing and shrieking, his hands leaving bloody prints on the kitchen floor as he tried to crawl away from the pain that was eating him alive. Charles tried to rush Martha, but she swung the cauldron in a wide arc that sent a wave of scalding oil across his path. He leapt back, cursing, as drops of molten fat spattered his waistcoat and began eating through the expensive fabric toward the skin beneath. "You've lost your mind," he screamed, backing toward the door. "You'll hang for this." "Maybe," Martha replied, her voice steady as stone despite the chaos erupting around her. "But you'll burn first." William Hayes had always prided himself on quick thinking under pressure. 20 years of managing field hands and overseers had taught him to read situations, to spot trouble before it erupted into full rebellion. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the sight of Martha Williams wielding liquid fire like some ancient goddess of vengeance. He lunged for the rifle mounted above the kitchen door, the same weapon his father had used to maintain order during the lean years after the war. His fingers closed around the barrel just as another wave of scalding lard swept across the room, missing him by inches, but close enough that he could feel the heat searing through his shirt. The colonel, despite his age, moved with the reflexes of a man who'd survived 4 years of warfare. He grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the counter, hefting it like a shield as he tried to circle around behind Martha. But she anticipated his movement, spinning with fluid grace to face him directly. "You think you know me," she said, her voice cutting through Thomas's continued screaming like a blade through silk. 20 years you watched me cook your food, clean your house, tend your fires. 20 years you looked right through me like I was smoke." She tilted the cauldron again, sending droplets of oil hissing across the floor. "But you never saw what was really cooking in this kitchen." The colonel raised the skillet higher, his weathered face twisted with rage and confusion. "Martha, this is madness. We treated you fair, gave you work when others wouldn't. You had a place here, a purpose." "A purpose," Martha repeated, the words dripping with 20 years of suppressed bitterness. "Yes, I had a purpose. Feed the masters, serve their needs, smile when they took everything I loved." Her eyes found his across the steam-filled kitchen. "Tell me, Colonel, What purpose did my Rebecca serve when you sold her south? What need of yours did that satisfy? The old man's face went pale beneath his weathered tan. That girl was trouble, stirring up ideas above her station. I did what was necessary to maintain order. Order! Martha laughed, a sound like winter wind through dead leaves. Your order cost me my daughter. Your order broke my heart into pieces so small, I thought they'd never fit back together. She stepped closer, the cauldron steady in her hands despite its weight. But they did fit back together, Colonel. They fit back together into something harder than diamond, sharper than any blade. William had the rifle now, fumbling with the loading mechanism as sweat dripped into his eyes. The kitchen had become a vision from hell, thick with steam and the stench of burning flesh. Thomas had stopped screaming, though whether from shock or death, William couldn't tell. His youngest brother lay curled in a corner, his body trembling like a broken bird. "Put down the pot, Martha," William called, his voice cracking despite his efforts to sound authoritative. "Put it down and we'll talk. We'll work something out." Martha turned toward him with that same radiant smile, as if he'd just offered her the greatest kindness in the world. "Work something out? Like you worked something out when Rebecca begged you not to separate her from her mama? Like you worked something out when she cried so hard she made herself sick?" The smile faded, replaced by something colder than winter stone. "No, Master William. The time for working things out is long past." Charles had been edging toward the back door, hoping to escape while Martha was distracted by his father and brother. But the kitchen was small, and 20 years of moving through it had given Martha an awareness of every sight line, every possible escape route. Without even turning to look at him, she swung the cauldron in his direction. This time her aim was perfect. The wave of boiling lard caught Charles full in the face and chest, transforming his scream into a gurgling sound that would haunt the walls of Riverside Manor long after his body stopped twitching. He fell backward through the door, his hands clawing at flesh that was no longer there, his fine burgundy waistcoat now fused to skin that bubbled and cracked like overcooked pork. "Two down," Martha said softly, as if marking items off a shopping list. The Colonel charged then, swinging the skillet with desperate fury. But Martha had spent decades dodging flying objects in this kitchen, ducking when the Hayes men threw plates in anger, stepping aside when they hurled bottles in drunken rage. She moved like water, flowing around his attack, while the iron pan whistled harmlessly through the air where her head had been. Her counterattack was swift and brutal. The edge of the cauldron caught the Colonel across the temple, sending him staggering sideways into the brick wall. Blood flowed down his face, mixing with the sweat and steam until he looked like a man melting in the heat of his own sins. "You want to know what I learned in 20 years of cooking for your family?" Martha asked, advancing on him with measured steps. "I learned that some meat needs to be tenderized before it's ready to eat. Beaten down, broken up, prepared proper." She raised the cauldron higher. "I learned that the best dishes come from ingredients that suffered the most." William finally got the rifle loaded, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely aim. The kitchen was thick with steam and smoke, Martha appearing and disappearing like a phantom conjured from his worst nightmares. He fired wild, the shot going high and wide, punching a hole through the ceiling and sending plaster raining down like snow. "Missed," Martha observed calmly. "But then, you Hayes men always were better at hitting things that couldn't fight back." She was on him before he could reload, the cauldron swinging in a wide arc that caught him across the ribs. The impact drove him to his knees, the rifle clattering across the floor and spinning into a corner where it could do no more harm. William tried to crawl after it, but Martha's foot came down on his back, pressing him flat against the blood-slicked stones. "Stay down," she commanded, and something in her voice convinced him that moving would be the last mistake he'd ever make. The Colonel was trying to stand, one hand pressed against the wall for support, the other stemming the flow of blood from his head wound. His grey waistcoat was torn and stained, his military bearing finally broken after 7 decades of absolute authority. "Martha," he gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, we can fix this. Whatever you want, whatever it takes, just stop." Martha looked at him with something that might have been pity, if pity could burn like molten gold. "What I want, Colonel, is my daughter back. Can you fix that? Can you reach down into that Louisiana grave and pull Rebecca up into the sunlight?" She shook her head slowly. "What I want is 20 years of my life back, 20 years of swallowing your poison and pretending it tasted like honey. Can you fix that?" The old man's shoulders sagged as the truth settled over him like a shroud. "No," he admitted. "No, I can't." "Then there's nothing to fix," Martha replied. "Nothing left but the cooking." She moved toward him with the steady pace of inevitability itself. The colonel tried to run, but his legs betrayed him, buckling under the weight of age and shock, and the terrible knowledge that his world was ending in fire and oil, and a servant's long-delayed justice. Martha caught him easily, her free hand tangling in his silver hair, pulling his head back to expose the throat that had issued so many cruel commands over the decades. The cauldron tilted, and liquid death poured down in a golden stream that turned his screams into steam, and his flesh into something no longer human. When it was over, when the last echo of agony had faded into the kitchen walls, Martha set the empty cauldron aside and surveyed her work. 4 bodies lay scattered across the floor like broken dolls, their fine clothes reduced to ash and memory, their proud faces transformed into something unrecognizable. William was still breathing, though barely. His eyes found hers across the ruined kitchen, filled with a pain that went deeper than his burns, a recognition of something fundamental that had shifted in the order of things. "Why?" he whispered through lips that were already beginning to blister. Martha knelt beside him, her weathered face gentle as a mother comforting a sick child. "Because some debts can only be paid in full," she said softly. "Because 20 years is a long time to wait for justice. Because my daughter's name was Rebecca, and she mattered more than your comfort." She stood then, brushing dust from her apron as if she'd just finished preparing an ordinary meal. The kitchen was ruined, filled with smoke and the stench of cooked flesh, but Martha moved through it with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained for 2 decades of servitude. At the door, she paused, looking back at the carnage one final time. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear voices calling, neighbors drawn by the gunshot and the screams. They would come soon, these good Christian folk who'd turned blind eyes to 20 years of cruelty, and they would shake their heads and speak of the tragedy that had befallen the Hayes family. But Martha would be gone by then, vanished into the same mist that had hidden runaway slaves for generations. She had no illusions about survival, no dreams of escape or freedom. This had never been about living through the aftermath. This had been about making sure the Hayes family's appetite for cruelty was finally, permanently satisfied. She stepped out into the grey morning, leaving behind the only world she'd known for 20 years. Behind her, the kitchen continued to smoke and steam, the walls holding their secrets close like a tomb that would never give up its dead. And in the distance, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to give thanks for their many blessings on this most holy of days. Martha Williams walked through the morning mist like a ghost returning to the earth that had birthed her. Behind her, Riverside Manor stood silent, except for the crackling flames that had begun to lick at the kitchen windows. The fire she'd started with the overturned oil lamp would consume the evidence, but more importantly, it would consume the lies. No more would that kitchen echo with false gratitude. No more would those walls witness the theatre of servitude disguised as family loyalty. The fog wrapped around her like a shroud woven from years of silence finally given voice. Each step carried her further from the world of masters and servants, deeper into the swamplands where only the desperate and the determined dared to tread. Spanish moss hung from cypress branches like the grey beards of ancient judges, and somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called out a song that sounded like weeping. She'd prepared for this moment just as carefully as she'd prepared the final feast. Hidden beneath the loose floorboard near the smokehouse was a canvas bag containing everything she'd need for the journey ahead. A change of clothes, dried meat wrapped in oilcloth, the small pouch of coins she'd saved penny by penny over 2 decades of unpaid labour. And most precious of all, a daguerreotype of Rebecca taken when the girl turned 16, her eyes bright with dreams that would never come to pass. The sound of hoofbeats reached her ears, still distant, but growing closer. Word would spread quickly once the bodies were discovered. Sheriff Morrison would organise a search party. Bloodhounds would be brought from the county seat, and every road leading north would be watched by men with ropes and righteousness in equal measure. They would call it justice, these good Christian folk who'd blessed every evil the Hayes family had committed with their silence. But Martha had never intended to run north. The Underground Railroad was for those who still believed in tomorrow, who carried hope like a candle flame cupped against the wind. Martha carried something different now, something that burned hotter and lasted longer than hope. She carried the satisfaction of accounts finally balanced, of debts paid in full with compound interest. Martha Williams vanished into the Louisiana bayou that grey November morning, swallowed by mist and memory like smoke dispersing into wind. They found the bodies 3 days later. The Hayes family transformed into something the coroner couldn't quite name in his official report. The kitchen had burned to ash, taking with it 20 years of silent screams and swallowed pride. Some say Martha died in those swamps, consumed by alligators or fever, or the weight of her own reckoning. Others whisper she made it to New Orleans, changed her name, and lived out her days cooking for families who never knew the fire that burned behind her gentle smile. But the truth is simpler and more terrible than legend. Martha Williams became what she'd always been, a story passed down in whispers, a reminder that patience has its limits, and some hungers can only be satisfied with blood. If this tale of Thanksgiving vengeance stirred something deep in your soul, hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who understands that history's most powerful truths are written not in books, but in the scars of those who refuse to stay silent.